At the turn of the millennium, there were signs. Was there something out there? A higher intelligence? A mysterious force at work? Beyond words, beyond comprehension. What will the new millennium bring? In theory, a shadowy construct fathomed by scientists at their wits' end over the quest for the answer to everything. Beyond time, beyond space, beyond gravity, beyond dimensions we understand. A natural force simply known as Millennium Force. The future is riding on it.
Of all the coasters I've ever seen, nothing blew me away quite as much as the first time I saw Millennium Force on Cedar Point's website back in the summer of 2000. I was a new coaster enthusiast, just starting to explore the coasters of the country and the world, and I saw a picture of Millennium Force and my jaw dropped. I had to get there, I had to ride it. My first opportunity came in 2002, and it did not disappoint. I ranked it as my number 2 overall coaster at the time, and it's the only coaster other than Ghost Rider to get a perfect 10 out of 10 from me. Since 2002, I've been back to Cedar Point 4 times and ridden Millennium Force many, many more times. So my rides are spread out over 2002, 2008, 2016, and 2018. Some love this coaster and some hate on it, and frankly, everybody is correct. This coaster has significant pros and cons, and that's what I'll be talking about today. The first pro is going to be the height and the drop. I'd say this thing towers over Cedar Point, but they have so many 200 plus foot structures and one 400 plus foot coaster that is just one of many things to look at with the Cedar Point skyline. But that drop is long and steep, and some people say they don't get airtime on it, but given the angle of descent at 80 degrees and the length of the train, if you're in the back row, you get tossed out of your seat. So it's definitely a great drop, and I would say it's the best drop at the park, which is saying a lot. The first con is that it is indeed a little bit forceless. People call it Millennium Forceless for a reason, and they're not wrong. Now I admit that I gray out on the first overbank, but after that it kind of meanders around. It's not built to be an airtime machine like Magnum, nor is it built to showcase intensity like Intimidator 305. It's almost like a tour of that side of the park. Not a huge knock, since I think this coaster does a lot of things well, but those who complain about it being forceless are not wrong. The second pro is the length. This is over 6,000 feet long, and you definitely feel it. If you waited in a long line, you don't feel cheated by the length of the ride. Like I said before, it's kind of giving you a tour of that side of the park, and since it's still a smooth ride after all these years, you're enjoying every single bit of it. The second con is the amount of overbanks. They really overdid it with the overbanks, and that's really the most prominent element of this ride. For those of you who don't know what an overbank is, it's a turn that's banked beyond 90 degrees. So as you turn, you're sort of tilting upside down, though it's not considered an inversion until you reach 135 degrees. Millennium Force's overbanks are only 122 degrees. I don't find these very exciting, and since Millennium Force focuses on these as a main element of the ride, it's sort of a letdown. The third pro is the setting. The lift and the first drop run right along the road against Lake Erie, and the entire layout flies over the water and the islands, which are pretty secluded from the rest of the park. This isn't flying over midways or anything. It's going over and around swampland before coming back towards the station and soaring past the queue and banking over it into the final breaks. For the amount of stuff Cedar Point crams into the peninsula, they found a great secluded setting for Millennium Force. The third con is the bugs. With a great setting comes great wildlife, and at night you're going to want to keep your mouth closed. Even as you go flying down big drops and whipping around corners and want to scream in terror or joy, I recommend not doing so unless you want a bunch of bugs flying in your mouth. It's an unavoidable consequence of Cedar Point's awesome lakeside setting, but just be aware that it's an inconvenience that gets kind of gross. The fourth pro is the trains. My favorite train design of all time has to be the wide-open Intamin trains that feature just a T-bar. Intamin has installed some awful restraints in his day, most notably the Superman the Ride U-Brick, the Skyrush Thigh Crusher, the hard plastic restraints you'll find on King to Ka, and even the bulky bar with the soft straps from I-305 I'm not crazy about. But those Intamin T-bars are phenomenal, and having nothing on your sides makes it even better. The fourth con is the loose article policy. Some rides at Cedar Point have this, like Top Thrill Dragster and Steel Vengeance, and I've seen this at other Cedar Fair parks like King's Dominion and Carowinds, but some rides just do not let you bring your stuff up to the station platform. If it fits in your pocket, that's fine, but bags, umbrellas, souvenir bottles, all of that will need a locker. Millennium Force unloads in a different station than where it loads, so this policy actually makes more sense here than it does for Fury or I-305. But honestly, unloading in a different station isn't much of a time saver unless they did it because they didn't have much space for people to exit on the other side of the station. I usually don't have loose articles when I go to Cedar Point, so it doesn't affect me, but if you do, be warned. The fifth pro is the fact that you're hard-pressed to find a more iconic coaster than this. It really isn't one of the top coasters in the world anymore, but it keeps winning the award for Best Steel Coaster as recently as 2015, and I think it's because it's so iconic in the coaster community. You could say that the Coney Island Cyclone and the Beast at Kings Island could rival it for being the most iconic coaster in the world, but I wouldn't consider it any lower than top 5. I saved the biggest pro and con for last, and the fifth and final con is the lack of airtime. There are 4 airtime moments built into this coaster, that being the first drop, the 2 camelbacks, and the final speed hill. This ride wasn't built to be an airtime machine, but 4 good pops of air would be sufficient. The first drop and the final speed hill do deliver good airtime, but the camelbacks have some weak floater at best. For a ride that has so many overbanks and is over 6,000 feet long, you'd think that they could have thrown in a couple more airtime moments in there. And it does keep the coaster from ranking higher than it could. The sixth and biggest pro is the speed. Overbanks, airtime hills, length, all those things are ancillary items in the total package that's Millennium Force. I believe Intamin built this primarily to be a speed machine. This coaster tops out at 92 miles per hour and stays low to the ground except when it pops up into an airtime hill or an overbank. And when you're zipping around the islands with breakneck speed, you really feel it. I love leaning into every turn and enjoying all that amazing speed that it maintains throughout the ride, all the way into the final flyover over the queue. Millennium Force has definitely been outclassed over the last 19 years, but it's still a great, well-rounded ride. It has a little airtime, a little intensity, a lot of length, and a lot of speed. It doesn't focus on one thing, and sometimes that can be a great thing for a ride. Unfortunately for Millennium Force, it doesn't do these things as well as it should, which is why it's barely in my top 20. I also think Fury is extremely well-rounded, but it does everything so much better, which is why it's in my top 3. But I still love Millennium Force, and that's why it's my second favorite coaster at Cedar Point. That's it for Millennium Force. It's one of those weird coasters that's underrated and overrated, and everyone who loves it or hates it have a point. But these are my thoughts, so you can take them or leave them. Let me know what you think of Millennium Force in the comments below. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys all next time.